In May 2026, the sudden escalation of the Iran war severed maritime logistics across the Middle East. Ocean freight routes choked, supply chain resource nationalism took hold, and the global economy absorbed an immediate, severe macroeconomic shock. Up until that month, international observers operated on a single hardened assumption. The United States and China were locked in an inescapable slide toward deep structural decoupling. The May 2026 summit in Beijing broke that consensus. Instead of accelerating the conflict during a global crisis, the two states established a highly calculated system of transactional realism. Both Washington and Beijing required immediate, short-term macroeconomic breathing room. They abandoned any attempt at a grand diplomatic bargain to resolve their deep ideological differences, focusing entirely on targeted compromises. The U.S. delegation arriving on Air Force One reflected this specific strategy. The group was highly corporate and distinctly hawkish, heavily reliant on officials like Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the chief architect of the administration's macroeconomic security. The resulting agreements present a specific question for modern statecraft. We need to examine exactly how the world's two largest superpowers successfully engineered a functional economic stabilization while leaving their foundational security disputes completely unresolved. Absolute economic isolation fails under the stress of a global supply chain collapse. When the shipping lanes freeze, superpowers instinctively architect narrow, pragmatic channels to manage their rivalry. Inside the Great Hall of the People, the diplomatic choreography was meticulously engineered. In Chinese statecraft, protocol serves as an optimized language of hierarchy and sovereignty. This 3D wireframe models the specific seating arrangement during the bilateral talks. Analysts observed the U.S. president's chair was distinctly lower than Xi Jinping's. This nuance served as a deliberate assertion of China's structural parity, visually rejecting any subordinate status in global affairs. Behind closed doors, that public posturing translated into severe operational friction, specifically regarding the transport corridors designated for the American delegation. Beijing maintained an absolute refusal to yield territorial control. They systematically rejected standard U.S. Secret Service protocols for the foreign deployment of presidential security assets. That friction extended to the corporate attendees. During the state banquet, defense intelligence leaks suggested that a waitress stationed directly behind a U.S. tech billionaire was actually an active serving officer of the People's Liberation Army. The stabilization engineered in Beijing has no anchor in mutual goodwill. It is a system built entirely on the management of deep atmospheric distrust. To manage that distrust, the summit abandoned erratic, unpredictable tariff escalations. Instead, the two powers pivoted toward institutionalizing their commercial exchanges. This financial matrix compares the two unprecedented bilateral institutions. The U.S.-China Board of Trade was given an exclusive mandate to clear commercial flow across non-sensitive consumer goods. The parallel Board of Investment was established to manage cross-border capital and structure joint ventures in non-defense sectors. Operating under this new framework, Washington secured massive macroeconomic deliverables. China immediately approved a commitment to purchase 200 American-made Boeing commercial aircraft, marking Beijing's first major corporate purchase of Boeing assets since 2017. The order functioned as an immediate stimulus designed to support high-skilled American manufacturing labor. The concessions extended directly to the agricultural sector. Beijing pledged to buy at least $17 billion annually in American agricultural goods across a 3-year cycle, building on baseline agreements from the previous fall. China also executed a systematic rollback of non-tariff barriers on American livestock. They completely renewed the active listings for over 400 U.S. beef and poultry processing facilities. These specific meat processing facilities had been intentionally deregistered and locked out of the Chinese market during prior trade skirmishes. The Trump administration aggressively utilized these targeted market concessions to satisfy its domestic mandate, lowering the overall bilateral trade deficit. This bar chart visualizes the underlying USTR data supporting that goal. Driven by strategic manufacturing onshoring and diversified supply chains over the prior fiscal year, the bilateral trade deficit had already dropped by 33%, a compression of $130 billion. These boards formalized a pragmatic truce. They demonstrate that both nations are willing to ruthlessly isolate their non-sensitive corporate revenue streams to protect them from the fallout of their zero-sum national security conflicts. Beyond consumer goods, the technology sector remained deeply contested. Advanced microchips and computational models have effectively become the ultimate sovereign assets of the 21st century. To negotiate these assets directly, the U.S. presidential delegation made the critical decision to include high-profile tech executives, notably NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang. The private ministerial talks produced a strict artificial intelligence protocol. Both governments pledged to build tight operational safeguards designed specifically to keep advanced, autonomous frontier AI models out of the hands of rogue networks. But cooperation coexisted with aggressive American leverage tactics. Washington approved the commercial sale of high-end graphics chips to verified Chinese entities, but intentionally withheld the physical delivery to enforce Beijing's compliance. China utilized its own primary strategic counterleverage, its dominant structural control over global critical mineral supply chains. The result was a micro-targeted trade-off. The U.S. offered access to high-end computing components in direct exchange for Chinese export baseline guarantees on vital industrial inputs, specifically yttrium and scandium. That same transactional logic dictated the maritime theater. The 2026 Iran war had severely restricted shipping lanes through the Middle East, driving up insurance premiums and destabilizing global energy markets. Seeking to contain the theater, President Trump secured a personal commitment from Xi Jinping to completely restrict the provision of direct military hardware flowing from Beijing to Tehran. Behind the scenes, Beijing executed the pivot. Using direct, high-level diplomatic contacts, Chinese officials pressured Iranian maritime authorities to grant transit exceptions through the contested zones. This flow map outlines the operational reality of the Strait of Hormuz. The resulting maritime easement provided immediate relief to global supply chains, but the safe transit corridor was exclusively restricted to Chinese-flagged commercial vessels. Despite these precise maneuvers, the foundational friction points remained. On the issue of Taiwan, Washington's strict adherence to strategic ambiguity met Beijing's absolute refusal to accept any explicit moves toward independence. High-end technology and maritime security are no longer governed by broad applications of international law. They are managed through micro-targeted transactional hostage-taking. While the Beijing Truce provided tactical stability for the two superpowers, it sent a systemic collateral shockwave through emerging economies, primarily violently destabilizing the trade landscape in India. Prior to the summit, India's national strategy was clear. New Delhi was aggressively expanding its domestic manufacturing capabilities, a policy based entirely on the assumption of a permanent, irreversible decoupling between the U.S. and China. This data matrix outlines the shift. For years, multinational corporations operated under a geopolitical risk premium. To avoid superpower crossfire, they relocated factory pipelines directly into Indian industrial parks. Converted to a line graph, we trace India's peak success while friction was highest. Manufacturing gross value added reached 9.13% growth. But as the risk premium compressed, that momentum abruptly stalled. The sudden implementation of the U.S.-China boards of trade instantly diluted the urgency of the geopolitical threat, effectively destroying India's geopolitical luxury. The new corporate reality was stark. With superpower commercial relations stabilized through structured channels, Western corporations lacked the absolute urgency to find an immediate alternative to Chinese manufacturing. Compounding the problem, India faced an enduring structural vulnerability. Despite massive growth in high-tech exports, a nation's factories remained heavily dependent on intermediate component parts imported directly from China. The outcome in Beijing forced New Delhi into a mandated pivot. India could no longer rely on diplomatic luck. To survive the stabilized market, they must immediately execute structural reforms to compress logistics and electricity costs. It also highlighted the absolute necessity of securing alternative lifelines. Finalizing sweeping trade agreements, like the historic pact concluded with the European Union, became critical to maintaining India's long-term strategic autonomy. The true scale of the 2026 summit is found in its outer rings. When Washington and Beijing successfully build a transactional architecture to manage their rivalry, The collateral damage falls entirely on the emerging markets that bet against their cooperation.